All right, so this is actually a great setup to our next speaker, and I want to give a little interlude here to Seth because I think it's a kind of a cool bridge to the next presentation. When having heard from Ari and Martin about A2CPS, about this DCC, it's a new one, and what you've already heard is they're going to be generating a lot of data in the multi-omic space, including genetics and genomics, transcriptomics, and making those accessible around molecular signatures of pain. And that could be, relevant to so many other common diseases beyond what the primary reason that they're taking these samples from people with knee and surgery, right? So it's more useful broadly for common disease. And so as a human geneticist, I think about the utility for A2CPS broader in terms of thinking about how people's response to pain and other common diseases and how we can marry this data. But the reason Seth is here is because it's an interesting serendipity, because about, I don't know, a month and a half ago, Mackenzie and I attended an NIH workshop about the Common Fund outreach and how we, as folks who are funded by the Common Fund or the NIH, think about how to raise awareness for Common Fund resources. And Seth gave a very interesting talk about he, as a student, was trying to access data from one of the Common Fund resources, Gabriella Miller Kids First. And that's one of our resources that's very heavily genetics focused. And it's an incredibly good resource for those of you who used it for rare disease. And you can go through a process to access data. And once you access data, there's a lot of things you can do. But he described his experience trying to access data and navigate Kids First, which I thought was very interesting because it taught me some things about how that's got done, but also is really useful for the community in terms of how one would go about doing it. So Seth is kind of like a target user from a computational perspective. And what's even cooler, moreover, is he's now just recently joined A2CPS to analyze some of the data that Ari and Martin just talked about. And so this is an example of someone who actually was an outsider using some CFDA data, coming to work on another DCC, but thinking about how to integrate data and make results accessible. So I thought it'd be really cool to have him come and talk about his experiences, sort of navigating a Common Fund resource, but also transitioning that to A2CPS. Because as a knowledge center, we think about how do we raise awareness to folks like you who are listening on this call to use the resources in the Common Fund to address scientific questions. And you all have different user experiences and profiles. So Seth is just one example of a type of user. So he's going to talk about his experiences, and I thought that'd be really useful for you all. So hopefully that was a decent introduction, Seth, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting our team. And also, I was looking at the list of participants. I want to say hello to everyone I've met throughout my time at the CFD who's watching, and to those who I have not yet met. But I'll share screen here. Let's just make sure this works. And yeah, so as discussed, as an undergrad, I was working with GMKF data on the Common Fund and initially struggled in how to navigate that data, but also how to create analytic workflows, custom pipelines to assess that data for what we were trying to find was sex-specific genomic differences underlying oral facial cleft etiology. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about that process of creating custom pipelines, accessing Common Fund resources and running them through a pipeline to answer any sort of scientific question you may have as a user or someone who's just looking at the Common Fund utility and how that whole process works. So in general, these are CFD analyses, and I'm going to do so through the avenue of talking about A2CPS hypothetical use case on the cloud. So yes, my name is Seth Berke. I'm a Post-Bacc researcher. And so, right, it would start with you, the user, as a scientist who has this whole world of trying to figure out new hypotheses, scientific investigations. And now at your disposal, you have CFD data coordinating centers that have a wide range, as we discussed today, of data resources, data types that could be cross-analyzed across different data coordinating centers. Just to name a few, I know there's one group that looks at exercise biology, another group that does nutrition, our group does chronic pain, some with extracellular RNA, and the list goes on. And I know the Knowledge Center has a website that outlines kind of each data type and how they could be used together. But anyways, say in our hypothetical study, we're using A2PCS or A2CPS data as discussed. And as the user, you're looking at these data, and you're thinking to yourself, what kind of analysis could be run? And so say based on your background, what you know about biology and physiology, you come up with this question. Again, this is purely hypothetical, but is there a relationship between prefrontal cortex activation and C-reactive protein levels for individuals who do develop chronic pain post-surgery? right? As the user, you understand that the fMRI data could show you something about prefrontal cortex activation and proteomics, and the assays that we're running have open release data about C-reactive proteins. So with that knowledge, you could formulate a hypothesis like this, and then you have to start thinking to yourself, well, how could I now process these data um, from the Common Fund? And the strategy that our team used when we were working with GMKF data that could be applied to any DCC or provider was this. So we would start on our local computer thinking about the processing steps that we needed to run these data. So in our case, there's fMRI data, proteomic data. Now there could be different scripts harnessing different computational environments to process them. And what do I mean by computational environment? Well, that could be the programming language that is used to run these data sets alongside the scientific packages that map directly to the environments you need to run these data. So for instance, say we're using R and our programming language to run some sort of statistical analysis to figure out this relationship. And there's going to be packages necessary to run these data types. So for instance, there might be an fMRI software package that could process the prefrontal cortex data, and there could be a proteomic package to process the proteomics data. This is similar to what we did with the genomics data from GMKF, where we used a scientific package called TRIO to assess case-parent proband trios to find some sort of linkage between a causal variant and our outcome variable. So now that we have these packages in mind, we have to figure out a way to put these onto the cloud so we could make our analysis function on the cloud. And luckily, there have been software containment platforms that have risen in the last decade, namely Docker and Singularity. But say we use Docker. This is a very common software containment platform. And what that means is these packages that we discussed can now be put into these boxes, these computational boxes that could be put to the cloud. So then you could run these data in the cloud. So say we construct our box that has our software containment in them. We choose a biomedical cloud platform that is available to the CFD. I worked heavily with CAVATICA, but there are others under the Seven Bridges domain, and also one called Terra, which our friends here at the Broad work with regularly. And so say we choose CAVATICA, for instance. Now, that Docker container that had our software that could be used to process our steps for our data types can be ported to CAVATICA. They have a Docker repository service that is directly integrated with Docker itself, as does many other biomedical cloud providers that are available to the CFDE. And so now that you have your scripts and your Docker container, the next step in an overall analysis like this could be or would be to port these software containers onto the cloud as discussed. Let me just check the time. Okay, we're good. And so after that, now that they're sitting on the cloud, you could create these processing steps. On CAVATICA, they're called tools. On other platforms, they're referred to by different platform-specific terminology. But essentially, these processing steps are going to ultimately be used to run these data to answer your scientific question, and they contain the software packages now necessary to run these environments on the cloud, right? So you have one step for your fMRI neuroimaging data that harnesses a certain script that you created locally that has software that will now operate on the cloud. Same thing with the proteomics data. And say you have another script that merges these data together to figure out some sort of linkage. So how do you connect these steps? That's the third fundamental that I'll discuss today. And the way to do that is with these custom workflows, which derive from workflow language systems, which are essentially their own programming languages that connect diverse steps that could harness different software environments together in a way where the data just flows through each step seamlessly. So the files that could be output as intermediate files don't even necessarily have to be added onto your storage, because these data that start in the cloud just filter all the way through to the end. And so in CAVATICA, the workflow language is called Common Workflow Language, but there are others, namely WDL, WDL, which Terra uses, and a few more. So with these steps in mind, you could imagine a world where now you're harnessing these data from A2CPS. That's part of the NDA. You work with our team and a cloud service provider to input these data onto their service, run them through a pipeline that you customly created based on your question of interest, and then output these results for some sort of scientific finding. And maybe you download them locally so you could work on data visualization software that's native to your computer. Um, and all for the end goal of scientific communication, right? To better the world. So once this whole process is understood, the idea is it's actually data coordinating center agnostic, language agnostic, and this way of thinking can apply to any sort of analysis that requires a custom workflow, because you have granular control over the scripts that you're creating, the software that you're running, and the cloud that you're harnessing. So you can imagine a situation where now you're choosing different data types and different data sets from across coordinating centers, data coordinating centers, putting them into your biomedical cloud platform and running any sort of investigation that's interesting to you. So as a user, that's what I think is exciting about CFDE and kind of how these pipelines can be created to answer novel science. And that's something that I hope helped a little bit out today in discussing. So yeah, thank you guys. Say thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Seth. Can you go back to the slide for a second? I have a question for you.
Oh yeah.
I really liked how you laid this out. I think it sort of describes it from the sense that like anybody could do this sort of thing. But I'm thinking as the knowledge center, just from my own, like when you say CAVATICA and results, what you'd actually also love is anybody who does this could make their results accessible on the knowledge center or through the DRC, depending on the format by which they're in, right? Because some of this you'd want to make open access to people. Is that sort of one extended use case for this in your mind?
I think so. I think any study that harnesses data that is not controlled access, such as genomics data, could be put onto a knowledge center portal as a use case that could be extendable to others interested. I agree. Yeah.
That's great. And do you imagine that for A2CPS, this is something that you hope to do? Like this is sort of the process you hope to employ for A2C for some of the analyses?
Down the line, yeah, I would hope so. As I look into PhD programs as well, it'd be something cool to do. So, yeah.
Other questions for Seth, Ari, Martin? See one popping in. All right, here's another one. Knowledge portals often to provide query and visualizations that do not require some substantial programming skills. Will a user interface be developed? Oh, wow. Someone was thinking like me. I love whoever you are. That's a great question. Seth, do you want to answer it from your perspective? And I can answer it. I think that's along the lines of the question I just asked, right? Which is, once that's done, you'd want it to be almost like button clickable, where you click on make this accessible via a portal. And it almost could be not a portal, but like a table. It's not a full portal in many cases. But you can imagine that could be something that where immediately we work with the DRC and the KC to either make it accessible via one of like the DRC's playbook modules. That's one option I can imagine, or through a visualization or a table that we make readily accessible on the KC as part of one of the workflows that we're building, or embedded in one of the DCCs if it's primarily from a DCC. I would love that opportunity. So if we could do this as a center, in fact, I think, there's about to be another center awarded from the CFDE for a cloud computing workspace. Hopefully that center will help work with us on that. And that's what I'm betting will happen. Other questions? Is someone in the chat? Anything else?
So Avi just messaged, do you think you can
Yeah,
convert your
actually, he
workflow?
just
Yeah.
Say it again, Mackenzie. Sorry, I would talk over you.
No, it's okay. Do you think you can convert your workflow into a workflow supported by the CFDE Playbook project?
I'm guessing this question is for me here. I would have to look in more depth with the CFD playbook project. I know it's extremely useful, and lowers the entry point for any researcher to go in and craft their own custom analysis, in a different way than harnessing biomedical cloud platforms. So it's something that I'd have to look into, and I could message after to see if it's possible. But
Yeah, in fact, Avi put in the extending it where you could actually, I think, probably convert it yourself. That's my guess, knowing the way Avi built things, but he put it in the chat. But frankly, that's exactly what I was thinking. The playbook is a perfect place for this extension and this coordination. So I agree with that. So let's make sure we follow up on that, because I know that would be something very accessible. Should we do this with you guys?
Yeah, I think it'd be really useful if there were some sort of like, ETL or translations made from the different the different cloud platforms, biomedical cloud platforms, so that you could collect all that data, right? So one of the things we have a portal system at TAC, and so whenever you run a job, right, you have data and you have your process, and then you even have like the hardware and that you're running it on. And there's a DOI that you can create that kind of collects all that together, into a set of metadata about that. And I think that every cloud platform probably has something like that. And I think that's just the challenge is converting that into the CFDA playbook.
I agree. Other questions for our presenters? Okay, well, we put this on, and someone kindly noted actually that the last month's webinar for HubMap wasn't online. It now is. So ask and ye shall receive. We got that online. So thank you for asking about that. It was like the link wasn't working. So it's up there now. And this webinar will also be up on our Knowledge Center page, and we'll circulate that to everybody after this. So you can take a look if you want to comb back through this. And also, if you didn't have a chance to do this, and also there'll be contacts in there for people if you want to follow up. And I think definitely this idea of the playbook is an awesome one. So Seth, we should communicate with Avi about that. And then Mackenzie, any final programming notes or things you want to wrap up on?
Just one last item. So thank you all for coming. Again, as Noelle said, this is recorded. Just want to give an update for our next webinar. Will be Friday, September 27th, and we'll have our presentation from xRNA. So we look forward to seeing you then, and please let me know if you have any questions or concerns in the meantime. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Happy long weekend. Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Seth.
thank you guys.
Bye.